Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here and for coming today. This is really fun. I'm excited to be here. So the paper I'm going to present today is one that I'm co-authoring with my colleague Sergio Tenenbaum. And it's part of a larger joint project that he and I have together on the nature of imperfect duties. And I'll touch on this broader project at the end of the talk. But as some of you might have guessed from the title, this talk is going to center around something that has become very famous in moral philosophy, Peter Singer's pond analogy. And this is an analogy that occurs within Singer's discussions of our moral obligations to aid the global poor. And what we're specifically interested in from those discussions is his claim that more or less whenever we spend money on seemingly ordinary pleasures or luxuries for ourselves, like say a dinner at a restaurant or concert tickets or new clothes that we don't need to stay warm, we're doing something wrong, and seriously so. Most of us regard these sorts of choices as ordinary, perfectly acceptable parts of life, at least insofar as they're not done excessively or extravagantly. But Singer argues that spending money in these ways is wrong. We should instead donate this money to organizations that provide life-saving aid to people in need. It is seriously wrong if we do not do so. So I'm going to call this conclusion always donate for short, in order to distinguish it from other points that Singer makes. In arguing for always donate, Singer draws the famous analogy. Imagine that you're on your way to work and you pass a small pond. To your surprise, you see that there's a young child drowning in it. There's no one else around. Wading in and rescuing the child would be easy and safe, but you would ruin your shoes and your suit. And you really like these shoes and this suit. So call this scenario pond. Clearly, you ought to save the child in pond. It would be horrendously wrong not to do so because you don't want to ruin your shoes and your suit. But Singer's suggestion is that more or less any time we spend money on a pleasure or luxury for ourselves, we're doing something morally equivalent to that. Instead of spending $100 on a nice dinner out, you could have an inexpensive meal at home. And you could donate the remaining money to an aid organization. If you did that, Singer says, this would save a life. Relief agencies, he says, can direct our aid to someone in need very effectively. Choosing to go to the restaurant, then, is just like choosing your new shoes over saving the child in the pond. It's choosing a small benefit for yourself over saving a life. It's wrong for the same reason and to the same extent. For simplicity, I'm going to call any choice between spending money on a pleasure or luxury for yourself and donating it charity. And so the pond analogy is the claim that the choice in pond and the choice in charity are morally equivalent. There have been many attempts to reply to Singer, and some of these replies make very good points, which we agree could figure importantly into understanding the nature of our duties to help the global poor. But what we argue is that various of these seemingly promising responses do not actually give us an answer to the pond analogy. So they don't actually get us out of the argument that the analogy itself gives for always donate. More specifically, we argue that rather than explaining where the analogy goes wrong, these replies each require for their own ideas to work as they're supposed to, presupposing that the analogy is mistaken. So they don't actually get us out of the argument. Instead, they make potentially good points, which depend on there being another prior answer. What this reveals, we'll see, is that responding to the pond analogy is a different and more fundamental task than people have understood. Before I go on, I should mention that while the pond analogy does provide a direct argument for always donate, Singer's argument's not supposed to be just that. It's not supposed to be just a simple appeal to the pond analogy. Instead, it's supposed to be an argument from general principles. The central principle that Singer invokes is what I'll call Singer's principle. If it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. Singer suggests that we all intuitively accept this principle and that always donate follows from it when combined with some other premises that he takes to be uncontroversial. One lesson of our paper, though, is that Singer's focus on deriving his conclusion from a general moral principle is mistaken. Singer's principle is easy to reject. It is the pond analogy itself that provides the powerful argument for the conclusion. Attempts to reject Singer's principle and weaker variations on it, too, don't actually impact the force of that argument. None of this is to say that we think the analogy is correct. And in the final part of the talk, I'll describe what we think is the right way to break the analogy. One second. Okay, so the first view that I'm going to talk about is an idea from Sam Scheffler, that morality includes an agent-centered prerogative. Unlike the views I'll talk about after, Scheffler doesn't give this idea specifically in response to Singer. But it gives good grounds on which to reject Singer's principle. And it might look like it gives a good response to always donate. And it's going to illustrate the general problem that we'll see come up for other views. So it's kind of a nice place to start. The idea of an agent-centered prerogative is the idea that there is a permission to give your own interests greater weight than those of other people when deciding what you yourself should do. The contrast to this is impartial consequentialism. This is a view on which you are required to always act in a way that will produce the outcome that is best from a fully impartial perspective, in which everyone's interests count equally. Scheffler points out that a very basic fact about human agency is that people do not operate from a purely impartial perspective. Each person has their own personal perspective from which they determine what they care about, evaluate how things are going, make decisions, and live their lives. Arguably, morality must work with this very basic core fact about human agency by, to some extent, allowing individuals to weigh their own interests more heavily than those of other people. So morality must include an agent-centered prerogative, a permission to give your own interests some extra weight. The idea of an agent-centered prerogative might seem to give us a good way to reject always donate. If I can give extra weight to my own interests, this should, we might think, explain why it can be permissible to not always donate money, when I could do so at what, impartially speaking, looks like just a small cost. But does this work? Well, to be plausible, the extra weight that the prerogative allows you to give your own interests must not be enough to make it permissible to leave the child to drown in the pond. The prerogative is not a blanket permission to follow your own interests no matter what. It's only a permission to give your interests a certain amount of extra weight. And pond is exactly the sort of scenario in which the extra weight that you can give yourself needs to not be enough to make it permissible to not help somebody. The prerogative would allow you to weigh your interests in not ruining your nice new clothes more heavily than a fully impersonal calculus would. But this extra weight needs to not be enough to make it permissible to not save the drowning child. Because, of course, you are required to save the child. But this means that if the agent-centered prerogative is to be of any help in explaining why always donate is false, we need a prior answer as to why pond and charity are morally different from each other. If charity and pond are analogous, the prerogative would apply just the same in both. We would have to say that just as in pond, while you can give your own interests extra weight, this extra weight is not going to be enough to make it permissible to go out for the dinner or to buy the new clothes when you could instead donate this money and save a life. So for the idea of an agent-centered prerogative to be of use in showing the mistake in always donate, we need to be able to reject the pond analogy on prior grounds. And it's not just that an agent-centered prerogative can't help us respond to Singer, unless we can reject the pond analogy on prior grounds. It's also that it can't do what it's supposed to do in general, unless we can do so. The agent-centered prerogative is supposed to be able to explain how we can permissibly pursue over time projects and relationships that are important to us from our own personal points of view. But unless we can explain why helping in pond is morally different from donating in charity, it won't be capable of doing that. Suppose, for example, that you have an aunt who you love and you want to maintain a close relationship with. Can the prerogative explain why you are permitted to spend money and time doing that? Well, it would be wrong to not save a child drowning in a pond, even if you're on your way to your only chance to visit your aunt this year. So unless we can say that the choice in your actual life between visiting your aunt and donating the money or the time is morally unlike this variation on pond, we would have to say the same thing there. That even with the bump from the agent-centered prerogative, your interest in visiting your aunt is not going to be enough to permit you to go ahead with the trip rather than donate the money. Okay, so the agent-centered prerogative can only do what it's supposed to do, namely explain why morality leaves room for things like going to visit your aunt, if there's a prior answer as to why the pond analogy is mistaken. And what we're going to see next is that the same problem arises for ideas that have been given specifically in response to the analogy. So turning to the next view. Several philosophers have proposed that the key difference between pond and charity is that pond is anomalous, whereas the opportunity to donate money is constantly there. As long as you have some expendable income, you will always be in a position to help people by donating. This is very different from what we assume to be the case in pond, that it is anomalous. It's a one-off, unusual situation. To get a morally analogous pond case to charity, we need to imagine that you are constantly encountering opportunities to rescue children from ponds. We need to imagine constant ponds, a world in which at every turn you're faced with the possibility of rescuing a child from a pond. Travis Timmerman argues that while you must rescue the child in the original pond case, it's not true that in constant ponds, you must always rescue a child whenever you can do so at only a small cost to yourself. We are not sure that this is the right thing to say about constant ponds, but regardless, what's important here is the suggested way out of the analogy. The suggestion is that whether a situation is anomalous or not can affect what you may permissibly do on a given occasion. It's one thing to say that you must rescue in a one-off, unusual situation. It's quite another to say that you must do so each time in a series of repeated opportunities to rescue. Why would that be? Jordan Thompson argues that this is because aggregate costs matter. When you face repeated low-cost rescue opportunities, while the cost of any single rescue alone looked at individually may be low, the aggregate cost of performing all the rescues is very high. Doing so would consume your life. These aggregate costs can justify refusing to rescue sometimes. This idea that aggregate costs matter seems very plausible to us, but does it work as a way out of the pond analogy and its implications? Well, return to the original pond case, where there's no ongoing issue with children drowning in ponds, and assume it's happening in the real world. Also, assume that you're someone who frequently donates money. Regardless of the extent of your charitable giving, you are morally required to rescue this child drowning in the pond in front of you. You can't claim that since you do a lot to help people at other times, through your many charitable donations, you don't have to help this time. How can the aggregationist say that? Why don't the aggregate cost to you of your donations, of those supposed repeated low-cost rescue efforts, make it permissible for you to forego rescuing this time? The aggregationist wants to say that this is because pond is anomalous. It's this one-off situation. But why is it anomalous? As far as anything they have said, it's just like the opportunities that you have all the time to donate, opportunities to save lives at little cost to yourself. If it's morally just like that, then the opportunity to rescue and pond is not anomalous at all. It is instead one of many opportunities that you constantly face to rescue people at low cost. So in other words, the claim that pond is anomalous just is a claim that the opportunity to save a child in pond is not the same, morally speaking, as opportunities that we face constantly, like the opportunity to donate money. It's different from that. It's unusual. This does not explain the disanalogy. It presupposes that there is a disanalogy. It's only true if there is a prior answer as to why pond and charity are different. So much like with the agent-centered prerogative, instead of explaining the difference between pond and charity, we have a potentially good idea that aggregate costs matter. That depends for its own ability to operate as it's supposed to, on there being another prior explanation. Okay, so let's turn to another approach. Some have argued that a Kantian understanding of the moral obligations that we have to people, to help people, so in other words, a Kantian understanding of our duty of beneficence, can explain why pond and charity are morally different. Let's look at a version of this from Karen's Store. But as we explain in the paper, the point I'm going to make here applies to other versions of the Kantian approach too. On the Kantian view, the duty of beneficence is a duty to have the happiness of other people as one of your ends. In other words, as one of your goals or aims. Store argues that this involves two sub-duties. First, it involves what she calls a wide duty to help others. This is a duty to help others sometimes. The idea is that you don't need to help everyone at every opportunity to count as having the happiness of others as your end. But you do need to help people sometimes. If you never help anybody, you clearly don't have the happiness of others as one of your ends. But Storr says there's also a second part of the Kantian view, namely a narrow duty to avoid indifference to others. The idea here is that having the happiness of others as your end requires that you're never indifferent to other people. She writes, although we're not always required to help, we are always required to not be indifferent. And she explains it's this aspect of the duty that can generate a specific duty to help someone in a given situation. Often it doesn't generate a specific duty to help. Often I can avoid manifesting indifference to you without helping you. I can show that I care about your plans to go on vacation by just expressing joy about it. I don't need to help you realize your plans by, say, making a financial contribution to your travel costs in order to not be indifferent. Or if you're moving, I don't necessarily need to help you move in order to not be indifferent. Politely explaining that I have a full schedule that day and so can't help is likely enough. But this is not always the case. In some situations, helping is the only way to not be indifferent to somebody. When that is so, there's no latitude to choose whether or not to help. And pond, Storr says, is like that. In pond, politely explaining to the drowning child that, regrettably, I have dinner reservations, so I can't stop to help, does not suffice. The only way to not manifest indifference to the child is to rescue them. This, then, according to Storr, is how pond is different morally from charity. In pond, there is no way to not manifest indifference other than to save the child. Whereas there are other ways besides, say, foregoing this particular trip to the movies and donating the money to avoid manifesting indifference to the global poor. You can do so by, say, donating or volunteering at other times. So we don't disagree that sometimes not helping manifests indifference while other times it doesn't. But what allows us to say that pond is on one side of this divide and charity is on the other? In pond, not rescuing the child because you don't want to miss your plans to go to the movies would manifest indifference. And that's true even if you're someone who has helped another child at another time. Why then is the same not true of a choice to go ahead to the movies tonight instead of donating the money? Sure, I could donate at other times, but I could do that and also forgo this trip to the movies and donate this money. Why then does it not express indifference to those in tremendous need for me to spend the money on the movie? One thing that might seem like a straightforward answer to this is that in Pond, you are uniquely positioned to help this child. In charity, on the other hand, you're not uniquely positioned to help any one victim. So you might think there's no person who you would be manifesting indifference to by going ahead to the movies. But consider a variation on Pond, Crowded Beach, from Violetta Ignesky. You are one of 50 people on a beach, a boat capsizes close to shore, and 6 children start drowning. Each of the 50 is capable of rescuing one child. Imagine that, say, only 2 people venture to rescue children, so 4 children still need to be helped, and you could rescue one of them. If so, you clearly are obligated to rescue one of them. It would be very wrong not to do so. Storr needs to say here that just as in Pond, not rescuing a child would manifest problematic indifference, even though there's no specific child of the 4 who you are uniquely positioned to help. Presumably, the idea would be that not rescuing any of the children manifests indifference to the 4 remaining children, who, if you were just willing to muddy your clothes, you could save one of their lives. And the problem is that it remains unclear why we wouldn't have to say the same thing about charity. That spending money on new clothes or movie tickets similarly manifests a problematic indifference to those in dire need, who, if you just donated this bit of money instead, you could save one of their lives. As with the other 2 views, the point is not that we think that Storr is mistaken in putting Pond on one side of the divide and charity on the other. The point is that the truth of this depends on there being a prior explanation as to why Pond and charity are different. Just as with the other views, instead of explaining where the analogy goes wrong, we have a good idea, which depends for its own ability to operate as intended. It depends on there being a prior different answer. Okay, so we're seeing that various seemingly promising responses to the analogy and to always donate don't actually work. But more broadly, what we're seeing is that the task of getting out of the analogy is a different and more fundamental task than people have understood. A plausible conception of morality needs to make sense of how the demands of morality can generally coexist with some degree of space to pursue our own lives and relationships, projects, and pursuits that we care about. Singer and others have threatened the idea that there really is any such space, given the immense suffering and need that exists in the world. But while we might take the suffering and need to give good grounds for thinking that our duties are much more demanding than people ordinarily suppose, that's not the same as accepting that there is little to no room for pursuing any other ends in life besides helping those in need. It's also not the same as accepting that we act gravely wrongly whenever we do things like go to a concert, or buy a new shirt, or eat at a restaurant. Those conclusions remain highly implausible. So many people have attempted to develop and motivate a different sort of conception from Singer's and others like his of how the demands of beneficence work. They've tried to develop ideas which reject principles like Singer's principle and other similar moral principles, and which are supposed to explain how the demands of beneficence, even if demanding, can coexist to some extent with other projects and aspects of our lives. The agent-centered prerogative is one such idea. Another is the Kantian idea that beneficence is a duty to adopt the happiness of others as one of your ends alongside others. The idea that aggregate costs matter is another contribution to this general project, and there are more. But what we're seeing is that rather than giving us a way out of the pond analogy and its strong implications, as people seem to think, these ideas actually require a prior answer to the analogy in order to function properly. The pond analogy threatens the coherent intended functioning of these sorts of ideas. Reflection on cases like pond show that the demands of beneficence can disrupt the pursuit of any of our ends, from the most frivolous activity to the most central projects in our lives. I have to rescue the child even if I'm on my way to my only chance to visit my aunt this year. Or I have to rescue the child even if my dream is to become a successful actor and I'm on my way to an important audition. Any of you needs to accept something like these conclusions if it's to be plausible. So for an idea or an apparatus to be capable of making sense of how morality can be consistent with some space to pursue our own lives, it must be able to treat the opportunities that we have all the time to donate very differently from the sort of opportunity that we have to save a life in pond. Without the ability to treat them differently, it will not be capable of explaining how we're permitted to do things like go to visit our aunt or take guitar lessons and so on. It will not be able to explain how we're permitted to do the steps or activities along the way that constitute our pursuing our projects or maintaining our relationships. So these ideas or apparatuses depend for their own ability to do what they're supposed to do on being able to reject the pond analogy. And since, as we've been seeing, they don't themselves tell us where the analogy is going wrong, this means that they depend on a prior account. So the coherent development and operation of these sorts of crucial ideas for understanding morality requires a prior different resolution of the analogy. Okay, so turning now to our view about the right way to break the analogy. What time are we at? I think we're fine. Okay, so something the views that we have discussed all have in common is that they each reject Singer's principle in some way or other. Each, if they work, is a reason to reject Singer's principle. What these views leave untouched, however, is Singer's auxiliary assumption that by donating the money that you might spend on a pleasure or luxury for yourself, you would save a life. There are some discussions, though, which call this into question. Some have pointed out that this assumption is naive or empirically dubious. But while that idea is out there, most philosophers have nonetheless effectively granted Singer this assumption. For some, this seems to be because they think that our ability to get out of the analogy and always donate should not depend on this sort of point. They think these strong conclusions should be false, even if that assumption is true. We think, though, that that is a fundamental mistake. We think the pond analogy fails exactly because that assumption is false. Indeed, we think that understanding this is crucial to understanding the very nature of the duty of beneficence in general, and even more generally, the nature of all imperfect duties. So in this final part of the talk, I'll sketch this view. Let's suppose that Doctors Without Borders makes an appeal to help the victims of the earthquake in Myanmar, and I'm considering whether I should contribute, say, $100 to it. What exactly will my contribution do? It's not as though Doctors Without Borders is waiting for my contribution to start their operations, or that a Doctors Without Borders volunteer is waiting on the phone with a pharmaceutical company and they keep updating the orders as contributions come in. Instead, they will probably plan operations that are compatible with their expected budget and will deal with potential budget shortfalls if and when they come along. Realistically, how Doctors Without Borders proceeds on the ground is likely not going to go substantially differently, give or take my contributing $100. This is not to say that my contribution wouldn't help their efforts, not at all. Many people making such contributions together help fund their life-saving efforts. So there's certainly an important way in which each donation helps or contributes to their work. But what it does tell us is that donating this money is unlike pond in a crucial respect, it's unlikely to make a substantial difference itself. Things are pretty certainly not going to go substantially differently in virtue of my individual donation. And in particular, realistically, no one's life is going to hang on whether or not I make this particular donation. In quite stark contrast, in pond, I clearly will make a big difference. There's a particular person who my actions will save. There's someone who will live who would not otherwise have. This is a major difference between pond and charity. In pond, my helping action has clear, strong, individual difference-making potential. That is, the difference between my doing it and my not doing it is large and clear, a person's life. The same is not true of an individual donation of mine. Again, I'm not at all denying that such contributions genuinely help the causes they're aiming to contribute to. I'm also not denying that we may have very substantial obligations to donate money to such efforts. The point is just that it's not the case that we can say that things would or are likely to go worse in clearly definable, substantial ways, like life or death for someone, were one to not make a given such contribution. So let's consider a variation on pond that's more analogous to charity in this respect. Imagine a case that is like Crowded Beach, except there is a group rescue effort already underway, with many capable, equipped people already involved. Also, imagine that while it will save some of the children, it's doubtful that the collective effort will be enough to save all of the children. Maybe some are further away in the water and time is running out. Even so, suppose that what is justifiably apparent to you is that given your own limited capabilities and given the collective effort already underway, your involvement would not make a substantial difference to what the group is able to do. You can tell that the outcome and the effort involved in getting there will not be substantially different, give or take your joining in the rescue operation. And in particular, it's clear to you that adding yourself into the mix is not going to make the difference between life and death for any of the children, or any other similarly substantial difference. This case is not analogous to charity in every respect, but it is analogous along the dimension we're identifying, your individual difference-making potential, or roughly analogous anyway. Is it wrong to not go into the water and try to help in this scenario? We don't think so. While many of us would be strongly inclined to try to do something helpful, and while that is a very good thing, someone who looks on to this rescue effort from the shore with concern but does not join in the effort has not acted wrongly in these circumstances. If it's clear to them that their involvement would not make any substantial difference, it seems permissible for them to trust this rescue effort to these capable others who are engaged in it. We think the crucial difference between pond and charity is like that. In pond, you will or could make a clear, large difference, a difference on the scale of whether someone lives or dies. While in charity, much like this example, you won't. This is the key moral difference, which explains why it is typically not wrong to pass up an individual opportunity to donate. Importantly, this is not only true, but it's already operative in ordinary thought. If, say, a canvasser comes to my neighbor's door collecting money for a relief agency tonight, and she turns them down, she's probably not thinking, sure, someone's gonna die who I could have just saved right there, but that's fine, because I save other people at other times, and I can't be expected to save everyone. No, she's most likely not thinking of the stakes of this choice as life or death for someone at all, or anything else of that sort. Instead, she's likely operating under some implicit awareness of exactly the point we're making. That while the charitable organization may be doing very important work, and while contributing to it may be a very good thing to do, no one's life or anything similarly large hangs on this particular decision of hers. And our point is that she's right to think that, and that this explains why it is indeed morally fine for her to pass up that individual opportunity to donate. Now, our view does imply that if things were very different from how they are, if there were good reason to believe that someone's life depended on whether or not you make a particular charitable contribution, then your moral situation would be different. In that sort of scenario, you might indeed be under a serious pro tanto obligation to make that particular contribution. But things would have to be quite unusual and very different from how they normally are for that to be the case. And we think that this implication of our view in that sort of very different, unusual scenario is actually very plausible. You might object, though, to the claim that things would need to be very different than they currently are for your donation to have the potential to make a difference on the scale of life or death. It might be true that for there to be a high chance of it, things would have to look very different. But surely you might say there's at least a small chance that by donating to an effective charitable organization, you could make the difference between life and death for someone. Think of a variation on pond in which there's only a small chance of saving the child. Maybe you realize they've been in the water long enough and there's only a faint hope that they are still alive. Even there, it seems like you are obligated to sacrifice your shoes or your plans to go to the movies to try to save the child. Call that scenario unlikely pond. The challenge for our proposed solution then is, why not think the choice in charity is like the choice in unlikely pond? It's worth noting that if this were the case, this would already be a very different analogy than what Singer imagined, with weaker and less clear implications than the original pond analogy. But much more importantly, we think this analogy is not right either. Charity is not like unlikely pond. Our argument for this has two parts, but for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about the first part here. Our first and core response is to argue that your difference-making potential in charity is simply not analogous to that of unlikely pond. The choice in charity is not a choice as to whether to take a small chance to save a life that would not otherwise be saved. There may indeed be a remote chance that your donation could save a life. Maybe your donation will, for example, make the difference between a shipment of supplies going out a bit earlier or a bit later. And maybe this will make the difference between life and death for someone. This is really, really unlikely, but it seems maybe possible. But this sort of remote possibility does not make charity similar to unlikely pond. In the typical case of donating to a large aid organization, there aren't grounds for thinking that this sort of remote chance is any greater than the remote chance of the reverse happening, of your donation making it the case that fewer people are saved. It could be that in virtue of your $100, a fundraising agent for the charity does not feel the need to do more fundraising that day. And this could mean they miss recruiting what would have been a substantially larger donation. This could have the downstream effect that fewer people are helped. Or it could be that if you hadn't given the $100, some higher executives in the organization would have, upon examining the numbers, decided that the donation revenue is just getting a bit too low, and there is the need for a new fundraising campaign. It's possible that had that happened, many more lives would have been saved. All these possibilities are very remote, but there's no reason to think they are more remote than the also remote possibility that your $100 would change the timing or the scale of operations such that more lives are saved than otherwise would have been. All of these are highly unlikely, sort of coincidental possibilities. What is likely is that while it is genuinely contributing, nothing large is going to turn on your individual donation. And we typically have no grounds for thinking that the remote chance that something large does turn on it are more positive than negative. Because of this, these sort of remote chances can typically be reasonably ignored. And we can simply focus on the standard way in which donating helps out, by contributing to the collective effort. So charity should not be thought of as a choice as to whether to take a small chance of saving a life, as an unlikely pond. It is instead a choice as to whether to help in a collective effort aimed at saving lives or at preventing suffering, where, while your contribution is helpful, nothing big depends on it. This is how ordinary people normally think about the choice, and we're arguing that they're right to think that way. When a contribution could help, but nothing major is going to turn on it, it's not wrong to refrain on any given occasion. But this does not mean that there's no obligation to give to charitable organizations. Many people making such contributions plays an important part in funding their life-saving efforts. Because of this, we think that, that there is what we can call an imperfect obligation to make such contributions. There's a duty that you can satisfy by giving enough over time. In fact, in our view, it's not only our duties to give to charitable organizations that are like this. We think that much of beneficence has the same structure. Suppose that I stop on the way to work in order to help someone whose car battery needs a boost, or to help someone who appears to be having a bit of a hard time carrying a heavy load. Or suppose that I hand a tissue to someone who's been crying on the subway. The reason to do these things is not that something major might depend on my doing so. Nothing very substantial, nothing like whether someone lives or dies, or suffers considerably more or less, is going to turn on my doing such a thing. Because of this, we think any one such act is typically not morally required. It would not be wrong for me to not dig into my bag for the tissue, or to not stop help the person having a bit of trouble with their parcel. These are very nice, good things to do, but not doing any one such thing is not impermissible, insofar as and because we're justified in thinking that nothing big will turn on it. Still, we do think it would be wrong to never do such things. There being a general supply of goodwill, of people who are helpful and kind to each other, even when nothing much is at stake, is part of what makes life good. Without an ample supply of goodwill, our lives would be greatly impoverished. Because of this, we can think of human beings as having something like a collective duty to ensure that there's a sufficient supply of goodwill, and that each of us has an individual duty to do our part in it. So while I'm not obligated to do any particular helpful act when nothing major turns on it, doing some things like this sometimes is not merely optional and supererogatory. We think this is roughly the right way to understand beneficence as an imperfect duty. Importantly, not all of beneficence is like that. When we're in a situation in which something major does turn on whether or not you help, like in pond, the duty is then a perfect one in which you are at least pro tanto obligated to help in that moment. We also don't think that what we're describing here is true only of beneficence. We think that this is the right way to understand the distinction between perfect and imperfect duties in general. Maybe stepping back for a second, I should explain that many philosophers have attempted to draw a distinction between perfect and imperfect duties. Roughly, imperfect duties are supposed to be obligations that allow for latitude, wide latitude, or room for choice in complying with them. They're supposed to be less strict and more flexible than perfect duties. Beneficence is often given as a paradigm example. Examples of perfect duties include the duty to keep a promise and the duty not to kill people. These duties do not seem to have the same sort of latitude and flexibility as the duty of beneficence and other so-called imperfect duties. But past attempts to explain and ground the distinction have, we think, run into a lot of trouble. We think that what we're describing here is actually the way to understand the distinction. Now, unlike what we're saying with beneficence, not all imperfect duties flow from collective duties. But our view is that the source and nature of an imperfect duty's imperfection is just like what we described with beneficence. Let's take our duties to our children as an example. There is a perfect duty to provide for their basic survival needs. But there's also arguably an imperfect duty to foster their happiness and help them develop into thriving adults. Why an imperfect duty? We think that what makes it an imperfect duty are the following facts. Typically, any one thing I might do to contribute to my kids' happiness or development, like taking them to the park this afternoon, spending time building Lego with them, helping them with their math homework one evening, is not in itself crucial. It would usually be a mistake to think that anything major depended on it. But doing enough such things regularly over time certainly does make a big difference to their overall happiness and development. And that is what you're obligated to do. This, in our view, is the way to explain the imperfect nature of the duty. It is imperfect because nothing much hangs on any one individual choice. What matters is that you do enough over time. And when we're in an exception to this, when there's reason to believe that something major for your child does depend on your doing something specific for them at a particular moment, then the duty to do so is a perfect one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Nefsky. A marvelous lecture, marvelously clear. And I'll keep the cue. Victor. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So, Singer's conclusion from the... Oh, thank you. Singer's conclusion from the drowning pond argument isn't just that you should give your money to any charity, but that you should give it to an effective or perhaps the most effective charity. And so I thought it was interesting that you brought up Doctors Without Borders. I mean, you might be right about how that organization works and that donating money might not make a difference. But what Singer and many other effective altruists would say is that you should donate your money elsewhere. So, for example, GiveWell is a research organization that studies how your charitable giving can make the most difference. Their most recent estimate is that you can save a life by contributing to the purchase of malarial bed nets for roughly $4,500. That's the expected value. That much money has the expected value of saving one life. My outfit is not worth that much, but there might be some professors on this campus who are wearing suits that cost that much, so they'd have to sacrifice that much if they jumped into the pond. To my knowledge, the way that charity works is that when you donate money, that increases the number of bed nets that are sent to people in sub-Saharan Africa. So isn't it true that there are actually, in fact, some charities where you can make a difference by spending the equivalent amount?
Okay, thank you for that question. Yeah, I mean, I wasn't putting anything on the choice of charity there. So yeah, I didn't claim, I'll kind of be agnostic here about whether you make any difference, but do you make a difference like life or death for somebody? Yeah, the claim is that this is quite a stable, the thing we're describing is pretty stable across charitable giving opportunities in our world. So yeah, it would apply to GiveWell. The calculation they're doing is not really a counterfactual difference-making calculation, I don't think. It is more of like a share of the total type calculation or an average effect calculation where you divide the effect of the, a large amount of donations by the number of people giving it. But also, yeah, I mean, I think like there's many things you can point out about how these charities work that would make you start being skeptical that calculation is capturing the difference between if you did it versus if you did not. I mean, the fundraising arm of these organizations is often separate from the decision-making arm. I don't think they're just changing their order of nets depending on like, oh, we bought another one, call up the manufacturer, get another bunch of nets. They will change how much fundraising effort they put in over time. Like there's many things. There's this great paper by Mark Budolfson and Dean Spears, the Hidden Zeros paper, where they're like, take those calculations and there's like all these things that could make one of the factors in that calculation go to zero. And then, yeah, it's literally no difference. But yeah, the general point is when you factor in all the things about these organizations, how they make decisions, how fundraising works relative to decision-making, it's not super plausible that what you're doing when you're deciding whether to go out for dinner or send the money is deciding whether or not to save a life. So yeah, that's maybe I'll leave it there and we'll see if people push me more on that.
Thanks.
Vic, do you want to pass it right behind you? Keep moving it up and we'll go forward. Yeah. Great.
Thank you. I want to ask about the symmetry between collective harm and collective benefit. Do you think that there is such symmetry. So I thought the pawn case is a case of collective benefit where my own contribution is towards something good, but might not end up making a huge difference. I was thinking in the cases of collective harm, it's a case where my bad doing, my private action is not gonna add up to. My own wrongdoing is not gonna add up to a great harm, but nevertheless, I feel the obligation to not do it. So, anyways, I'm just wondering if you think there is a symmetry or if there is an asymmetry between these.
Yeah, that's a great question. Is there a symmetry between? So I guess what you're observing is that I'm describing charitable giving as like a collective effort. You're taking part in a collective effort where any one contribution, at least if we're talking about, a few $100s and stuff here and there, it's not going to make a big difference itself, but together they are doing important things. And then you're saying is the same. And I'm saying that any one of those things is not required. Any one individual contribution is not required individually, but we might be required to contribute over time to those efforts. And then you're saying is the same true. Would I describe the duty in the case of collective harm similarly, where, take contributing to climate change, let's say, like if I flew here, did that, maybe you might think not a lot hangs on that decision of mine, but if everybody's doing things like that, do make a big difference. So actually, in that case, I do have the view that our duties are imperfect, that the obligation is, in the sense that I've described, it's an obligation to reduce your emissions and not, you shouldn't be thinking each time you go in a car or each time you fly that a huge amount hangs on that one choice and that it would be horribly wrong if you did it, but you should be reducing your emissions over time. So I would say that in that case. That's not to say that there can never be differences brought about by the difference between contributing to harm versus benefiting. And, there's a question, I consider it a separate question of is there a reason to not participate in a harm, even if, it's definitely going to, I take this to be a different question. Even if it's definitely going to happen, is it wrong to participate in it? And you might, depending on your answer to that, it could affect your view about the question you're asking. So I'm open to there being a disanalogy between the two cases.
Can you pass it back again? Yeah, great.
Awesome. Thanks for the talk. So this is pushing in the same direction as the first question. So I'm part of a Facebook group. It's basically like mutual aid Facebook group where people will say, hey, I'm having trouble feeding my kids this week. Can you send me a couple dollars via Venmo? And I'll do that. And seems like that makes a difference in a more direct way than the charities you have in mind. And you might think that $10 is not actually making a huge difference, but then maybe the response is actually what I should be doing is not just sending $10 every once in a while, but giving on through that Facebook page or whatever, $2,000 so that the marginal benefit from my contribution actually is difference making in the way you're after. So I guess I'm wondering what you think about that sort of case. And then just more generally, my reaction is that it's sort of strange that our duties would turn so much on the internal business model of these fundraising organizations. So that just struck me as sort of an odd implication, and would love to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, your example might help me show that this isn't really so. The mechanism could be different in different. It's not depending so much on their internal models, because I think the example you gave is another one where the point might apply in a few different ways. Firstly, you have to think what is the example? So suppose it's you could give them $10 or $50, and it seems like that would help. They're saying they can't feed their family and they're having trouble with that. And there's a few ways in which to think that whether or not their family eats that week might not depend on this choice of yours. This isn't to say, so yeah, I'll come back to what it's not to say in a minute, but for one thing, they could go to a food bank. Another thing is somebody else might send the money to them. There's many ways in which you can't really, when you give the money, you might not even really be thinking, man, now those people are eating and they wouldn't have eaten if it weren't for me. You're probably not thinking that at all. My guess is you're not like, man, those people are going to starve if it weren't for me. But what you might be thinking is, somebody's got to do this. I'm going to do that. And there's a way in which you are the one feeding them if you give them the money. And that's true of charitable giving too. If you're giving the money, you are among those, or you are one of the ones helping them. It's like volunteer work. If I volunteer with Doctors Without Borders, let's say, when I go to volunteer, if I was a doctor, I'm not necessarily going under the impression that if I don't, these people are going to die out there. Like I might recognize somebody else is going to take my place or pick up the slack if I don't go. But if I do go, I am the one doing the work. I am the one helping the people. So I am doing something very important. But suppose I decide not to go this week, that's okay. This is supposed to explain not why you're not doing something good if you do go, but why it's okay to maybe take an evening off from volunteering at the soup kitchen, or why it's okay that you just sent $50 and not $100. It's supposed to explain that it would be a mistake to think that something big depends on whether you send 50 or 100, or whether you do it this week or not. But that's not to say you're not doing something very important and very good if you do send it. Somebody has got to help these people, and you'd be taking that rule. So yeah, that's one thing to say. Another thing to say is that, I don't know if I should go on or take another question, but maybe I'll just throw this in here, that it's not that we think that the agent-centered prerogative, for example, this is just more of an example, but that it can't give you anything unless we can reject the pawn analogy. And so it can give you something like, so suppose you are deciding whether or not to give them the money, and you could be pretty confident that they'll eat. If you don't, they'll find another way to eat. But this would be helpful, be more convenient for them. The agent-centered prerogative could give you grounds to explain why it's not wrong if you don't. It's good if you do, but it's not wrong if you don't. Just like how, you could use the agent-centered prerogative to explain why I don't have to ruin my shoes to save your nicer shoes from the pond, you can use the agent-centered prerogative without breaking the pond analogy to explain anything that would work in the pond case. If it's just going to be you are going to make a difference, but it's just like a fairly small difference, then there's other things we can utilize to explain why, while it's good, it's not obligatory.
Let's go to Chris.
You say there's an imperfect duty. Is a duty you can satisfy by giving enough over time. And at the end you say what matters is doing enough of such things regularly over time. And I'm wondering what the standard of enough is, because if enough means you're giving enough so that the charity is able to meet whatever need it's designed to meet, well, of course it's not our duty to give every time if that's just going to mean the charities have more money than they need. So what's the standard of enough?
Great question. I don't know if I'll have a satisfying answer for it. That's good. That's the next part of our project. No, I'm just kidding. No, what is enough? So, there might be, one thing to say is the way we're thinking of it here, at least, is that there's some kind of collective duty to help people who are suffering, and that you can have a duty to do your part in that. So if that's what you're thinking about it, there's going to be some division, some way of thinking about how this divides. However, a key thing about our conception is that it's vague. a way of putting it is that, on our view, imperfect duties are like vague projects. And so there's not going to be like a very precise thing to say about what is enough. Now, that is not very helpful. The point is, you've got some kind of obligation to do your part in this collective effort. It's not, explaining what that is not going to be some kind of very precise thing. Now, what exactly does it look like? You're going to have to bring in more to answer that. One thing you could, I don't know. There's lots of things you could say, but you might have an obligation to give quite a bit, but the thing that we're focused on in this paper, though, is not really understanding that. It's more, why don't I always have to give another bit? Why can I ever, the thing we're focused on in this paper is not, though I hope we will say more about it elsewhere, is not really how much do I have to do, but more, how do we explain why it's ever okay for me to go to a movie? Or why it's ever okay for me to buy a new shirt. So that's what we're trying to answer here. But you're right, there is a big question of how are we going to understand what the actual thing we have to do is.
Well,
wait for the book. We're writing a book together on that.
One view about what's enough is you're giving enough so that the charity is able to meet its need. Another view that people have often offered about imperfect duties is that there's something like a fair share. Mm-hmm. But of course, that leaves open the question, what are you supposed to do if other people are not doing their fair share and people are starving as a result, say? Mm-hmm. So it seems to me you do need some more than vague standard.
Yeah, well, I guess one thing on do I have to give enough to get them to the place where they can do something that they couldn't otherwise have done? So maybe if I gave away thousands of dollars, maybe they could then save more lives. What if I gave away $20,000? You might think, do I have to do that if we think that could save life? And again, here I want to say, when we said that the pond analogy needs to be broken for these ideas like the agent-centered prerogative to work, it's not that they can't do anything without it. So I think you can think suppose it would take me giving up all my retirement savings, and if I did that, then they would be able to save many, many more lives. Do I have to do that? I think we can say no, as long as you think you're not required to give up all your retirement savings in order to save a child. So there's things you could say, it's not like you don't have to do whatever it takes to save a life. If you think there's certain things that you're not required to give up in order to save life. So it's not going to be so demanding that you have to give up more than you would have to say save the relevant number of lives. But it could be quite demanding, and I guess this is going to be we're going to have to bring in further ideas in order to the stuff we've said here is not going to answer that question of how demanding the duty is, or how do we come to an understanding of that. It might depend partly on how far our point goes. Should we think about our contributions over the course of our lives as really making a big difference? Or is that kind of not the right way to think about them at all? And we should be thinking about what we're doing, why it's important in a somewhat different way. So, further questions will need to be sort of unraveled before I could give a more satisfying view about the extent of the obligation.
Adam.
Hey, thanks a lot for your talk. I was a little confused about some stuff on the back, last page of the handout, so I was wondering if you could help me out with that. So you grant that giving to charity is, as you've put it, helpful, and that's part of why you should do some of it, which I take it means you're granting that it has an expected positive impact on the world. But then your point one that you make earlier on in this page, I thought you were, so let's suppose it's, it's a decent amount of money. You're selling your car and it's going to be 10 grand or something like that. Okay, well, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the expected outcome is positive. But it seemed like under point one, you were saying, well, I don't know, you give the 10 grand, maybe they spend it on some good stuff. Maybe the person fundraising thinks, oh, I'll go home and, give up for a few days. And it turns out to be, it seemed like under one, you were saying, actually, it turns out the expected impact is neutral because you have no idea. Maybe the 10 grand buys a bunch of malaria nets. Maybe the 10 grand means that they decide to be lazier or something like that. But that just seems to contradict what you were saying below. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, that point in one, which this is like the reply to the unlikely pawn thing, it's not really taking a stance on whether like we should think of about the expected benefit, or, it's consistent with saying that you're more likely to do good than bad, let's say. It's consistent with that. The point was about tiny chances of big differences. So like the unlikely pawn claim is a claim, that sort of claim is like, well, isn't it that you've got a small chance of a big difference, like saving a life? And the claim was that is not a good argument. It's in an unlikely pawn. Yeah, you should save the child. You should try to save the child because there's a small chance of saving their life. We don't think that you should make a donation because there's a small chance that you're going to change the way this organization's doing things such that more people are saved. So a kind of analogy that might help here is exercise. Like suppose you exercise because you care about your longevity. Like suppose that, or at least that's like a big driver for you. You really value longevity. You know that exercise helps with longevity. And so that's why you do it. And now you're wondering, do I have to jog today? Like, do I have to go on a jog today? Well, you have reason to jog from the contribution it's going to make towards longevity, because exercising enough over time helps you live longer generally. But that doesn't mean you have an obligation you have a rational obligation to exercise today. It seems like that would be weird if we got that result. So imagine somebody gives you this argument. No, you have to exercise today. It's not just that it's helping along this project of longevity, but there's a tiny chance that if you exercise today, you're going to save your life. Because there could be some kind of thing that happens to you where you exercise and it unclogs your artery or something happens where because you exercise today, it's going to make the difference between you living long and not. Now, there could be a tiny chance that my exercising today could make a difference between me living a very long life and not. But that would be a really bad argument because the tiny chance that the exercise today would kill me is just as large. There's no reason to think the tiny chance that exercising will save my life today versus that it will kill me that either of those is any more. It could give you a heart attack. It could lead to an injury that has some kind of downstream effect that you need an operation, and then that has an infection and so on. So the point is, the claim is that in the case of exercise, appealing to a tiny chance that my jog today will make a big difference to my longevity would be a bad argument. But that's not to say that the reason I have to jog today has nothing to do with longevity. My jogging regularly over time does contribute to my longevity. It does make it more likely that I'll live a long life. So that's sort of this point is similar in the case of charitable giving.
Bethany.
Thank you so much. So I worry I'm being a little bit dense because this is going to be on the same thread. But so I'm a little worried that Unlikely Pond is not capturing the kind of situation that GiveWell and the Against Malaria Fund is in. So I'm going to propose the kind of thought experiment that I'm actually generally really skeptical of. So take that with a grain of salt. But I'm sort of imagining we've got the sort of pond situation, and what you're told is here's this button. If you press it, the expectation value that you save this child's life for, I think the way they do it is 30 years for $4,500 or whatever. And your suit will get certainly ruined. And you may or may not, like the expectation is that you will save it for, and we need to know more about what exactly, how that's computed or whatever. But like, I don't know, I feel like my intuition on that is like, yeah, I should probably press the button. Like, so I guess I'm wondering like what the sort of expectation value thing is not capturing about the way that you think we should be thinking about these situations.
So are you saying that the charitable giving is analogous to that button case where if
that would be the thought, yeah, particularly for these effective charities that say here's how many months of life X dollars buys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, so the claim is that when they say that, that is a useful thing for something, but it's not a calculation of the difference between if you did it and if you didn't. Is it a good? So is it a good estimate of your expected benefit? I am skeptical of that. I don't think that's the way to understand the expected benefit of your giving that money. So I guess that's, yeah.
Okay. Maybe a conversation for later.
Okay.
Salim?
So everyone's been asking about the positive stuff at the end, so I thought maybe I'd ask a question about the negative part of the paper. So I agree that the three sort of responses to Singer that you go through don't seem fully convincing, but I wasn't entirely buying your diagnosis of why that is. So you said in all three cases that these responses require a prior explanation of why pond and charity are different. But it seemed to me they kind of are offering an explanation of why they're disanalogous. It just doesn't seem to be a very good one, as opposed to relying on a prior one. So, I mean, this is clearest in, I think, the anomalous view. I mean, the proposal is that the source of disanalogy is whether or not the thing is anomalous or not. And that, as brought out by the fact that advocates of this think in the constant ponds, when you make the sort of pond-like situation non-anomalous, when you make it non-anomalous, then you're no longer under a strict duty. I mean, where it seems wrong is that the reverse case seems really implausible. If you suddenly make charity things only like, whatever, for whatever reason, the charity infrastructure breaks down, and then just like one time they get everything back online and they give me the one opportunity and it's going to break. It doesn't seem like then suddenly it's a perfect duty or whatever. And similarly in the case of the agent-centered prerogatives, I mean, it kind of seems to me to be pointing us toward a source of the disanalogy, namely to what degree, whatever, doing the rescue or giving the money would stand in the way of your projects, and stuff. But, which actually seems, but it doesn't seem very plausible. Then it seems like a version of the, version of the rescue case where it's not just like random shoes, but it's the shoes that you like collect because you're like a collector of whatever, like, fancy sneakers, then maybe you have like a less pressing duty actually it seems like maybe on that explanation, if you're just doing a one-off dinner because you enjoy it, the explanation wouldn't kick in. But if it's like spending money on your record collection instead of donating it, it would. So, so it seems to me it was a way of understanding this where they are suggesting an analogy. And similarly, in the other third case, the adopting as an end, it seems like the proposal is just about whether you're manifesting indifference, and then again, it seems to me like the problem there is just that it's extensionally inadequate, not that it's not, not giving a source of the disanalogy, it's sometimes it's kind of fuzzily pointing you in the general direction. But your argument of surgery seemed to be that, but there's this like independent way of differentiating, and I just wasn't quite getting that in all three of the cases. Yeah.
Okay, well, let me try it to convince you. So taking the anomalous, non-anomalous. Now, one thing they can't appeal to is just some difference. Like, they can't just be like, there's something different about pond. Like, you're rescuing a child from drowning by pulling him out of the water. Like, that's not going to show that pond is anomalous. So maybe I'm missing what your point is. Actually, let me back up, okay? The first claim we made is that the claim that pond is anomalous, we said that depends on knowing that pond is not just like charity, morally speaking. Because if pond is just, and they seem to think it is, because they're like the analogous thing is like constant ponds, so they seem to think of pond, and they never deny that it's just like charity and that like what you're doing when you give to charity, when you give to charity, you're like saving a life at low cost to yourself. So as far as anything they said, the choice in pond individually is just like an individual choice in charity. And then our point is, but then pond is not anomalous in the real world because we're constantly surrounded by opportunities to save, according to them, to save lives at low cost. In other words, pond in the real world is just this constant pond situation if you haven't shown that pond and charity are different. Because when I save the child in pond, well, it's part of a series of opportunities that I constantly have to rescue people. Those ones are through donations. This one's through pulling a kid out of the water. But as far as anything they said, that's analogous to constant ponds. They're all opportunities to save a child at low cost or save somebody at low cost. So the point is, the claim that pond is anomalous depends on assuming that there's some difference between pond and charity. And then what I was going to say...
Actually, can I say something on that? Because I think that exactly... Because as I'm reading it, they think constant ponds and charity are not different. That's the whole point. Yeah. But you just said that... So in one way of reading it, really the situation, it's not the one-off choice thing. Really, we have to look at the wider thing. That's the relevant case. And then a morally relevant consideration is whether it's a one-off choice, or something. Yeah,
but
that's all. I mean, the crudest version of the proposal, it's just that.
Well, but do they want to accept that you don't have? If you're just that you don't have to accept the child in pond in the no.
I thought that was the whole.
No, sorry. In constant ponds. Yeah. No, but imagine you're not in constant ponds. You're in the real world, and there's a child drowning in a pond.
Yeah.
They do not want to say.
Yeah, I know, because
one of them does. There's one philosopher who's okay with it. Yeah. But mostly they don't want to say that you don't have to rescue the child here because you gave a lot to charity on other days. Yeah. Okay, so isn't that
sorry, but that's
not
slightly
convincing
different.
You of our point.
So that's whether this type of rescue situation of what you would have to do for it, whether that is anomalous.
Okay, so that was the thing I was going to say, but then for a minute I thought that wasn't where you were at. So yeah, if the thought is though that it's anomalous because of descriptive things about it, like there's distinguishing features. This one, I'm saving a child by pulling them out of a pond. Over here, I'm saving a child by sending money to an aid organization. So if that's what's supposed to make pond anomalous, that's not going to work for them. Every opportunity that we have to donate money has something distinguishing it from every other opportunity we have to donate money. If I send money now to the victims of the earthquake at this moment in time, that's a different opportunity in various descriptive elements than sending money at another time to even that same effort, or to Ukraine or whatever it may be. So like everything has you need something morally relevant distinguishing feature. And the point is that to get one, what you're looking for really is a morally relevant difference between pond and charity. Yeah. And then I guess, should I go through the other? So I mean, for the other ones, yeah, I mean, the thought is that I like the way you put that about the agent-centered prerogative, but the thought is that, okay, it'd be one thing if rescuing the child meant giving up your, I could never see my own child again. If I rescued the child, then you could use the agent-centered prerogative to explain why I don't have to rescue the child, and you can use the agent-centered prerogative to explain why I don't have to give that much to charity, such that I can no longer take care of my child at all. So you could use an agent-centered prerogative to explain why I don't have to give up my relationships entirely or my projects entirely. But what you can't seem to use it to explain is why I can do the steps or the activities along the way that constitute my having those projects or relationships. Because, like you have to, even if you're doing one of those things along, that's like picking your kid up from school, and they're going to be upset if you're late. Like you still have to save the child in pond, or even you can raise the stakes from that. Like even if you have to miss their birthday party, or even if you're going to miss your lecture as a professor, like you have to give up these things along the way that are what constitute your having those projects. You have to give those up in order to save a child in pond. And it doesn't seem like they're going to be able, that a person who likes the idea of an agent-centered prerogative can help themselves to the idea that, so they couldn't then say, well, I don't have to give to charity here if it means not being able to throw a birthday party for my kid, because that's a very important project for me. That's not going to work because you would have to give up the birthday party to save a child in pond. And the broader idea is that this view is not going to be able to consistently do what it wants to do if you can't break the pond analogy, because it does tell us a story about why we can have the project or the relationship, but it's going to have trouble explaining why we get to do the stuff that constitutes having the project or relationship without some understanding of why why it's different than, why pursuing it is different than the equivalent pond scenario.
I think we'll have to end on the birthday party because tragically there's an event right after this and many questions weren't answered. Speaks to this paper was not an anomaly. It's part of a larger, the corpus of Professor Nefsky. So I want to first, this is the last public lecture. We've had a record number of public lectures this year. So I want to express gratitude to my colleagues, to Meg for spearheading them, for Claire, for Alex, who's outside. We've taken on a lot this year and it's been extraordinary. So thank you all, first of all. I mean, this was the first thought experiment I was ever exposed to back in high school. And I feel like the fact that 45 years later, we're still working through it and getting fresh insights, it either says something about us or the analogy or some combination. But thank you, Professor Nefsky, for this. It's terrific.